May 5th, 1863. The Army of the Potomac has just suffered their most humiliating defeat of the war. The Confederates, under the near deity, Robert E. Lee, had been outnumbered nearly 3-1 and have emerged with their most impressive victory of the Civil War. Even today, Chancellorsville is considered by most historians to be Lee's greatest military triumph. Overconfidence, passivity, and mismanagement had doomed Union forces under New England-born Major General Joseph P. Hooker. And as his men retreat towards United States Ford in the driving rain, they wonder when, if ever, victory will come against the formidable army of Northern Virginia. As word filters back to Washington, Commander-in-Chief President Abraham Lincoln, who had followed events of the battle closely at the telegraph office, expresses shock and dismay. What will the country say? He wonders aloud. Lincoln, despite the defeat, plans to stay with Hooker, to whom he is partial. But by mid-May 1863, Hooker's own subordinate commanders, Darius Couch and John Reynolds, express a severe lack of confidence in him. Lincoln, frustrated by this, as well as Reynolds and Couch's refusal to take command of the Army of the Potomac, stubbornly sticks with Hooker, saying he was not disposed to throw away a gun if it misfires once. He would pick the lock and try again. But it is not clear whether Hooker has any bullets left in the gun. He is morphed into the man whom Lincoln despises the most, George McClellan. Hooker's endless calls for reinforcements after Chancellorsville are repeatedly denied, until finally, on June 27th, Hooker submits his resignation. And probably to his great surprise, Lincoln accepts it. Lincoln, addressing his cabinet the next day, makes it clear that he observes the same failings in Hooker that were observed in McClellan after Antietam, a want of alacrity to obey, and a greedy call for more troops, which cannot be taken from other points.
George Meade was almost everybody's last choice for commander of the Army of the Potomac. Abraham Lincoln does not offer command of the Army of the Potomac to Meade. He orders him to take command of it. It wasn't a request like the others. It was, I've run out of generals. You're the only one left. Congratulations, you're now in command of the Army of the Potomac.
The disarray in the Army of the Potomac contrasts sharply with the confidence with which Lee and his 70,000 men enter Pennsylvania.
Lee had put so much of his emphasis on being allowed to take the Army of Northern Virginia into an invasion of the North. His argument had been that the way to win the war, the way to take pressure off the Union seizure of the Mississippi River Valley, the way to spare Vicksburg was to invade the North. Fight a battle on the Susquehanna, fight a battle on Northern soil. That's going to turn Northern opinion so much in the direction of peace that Northerners will demand that the Lincoln government negotiate.
On the same day Lincoln addresses his cabinet regarding Hooker, Lee at Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, learns from a spy that the Federals are concentrated just to the south at Frederick, Maryland. And more intriguing to Lee, Union troops are fighting under a new commander.
When Lee finally learns that Meade has replaced Hooker as commander of the Army of the Potomac, his first comment is to say, General Meade will make no mistake in my front, and if I make a mistake, he'll be quick to take advantage of it. Understand that up till this point, the Army of the Potomac had been a collection of losers. They had lost battle after battle after battle. Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, even the one quasi-victory they had won at Antietam in the fall of 1862 was still only a quasi-victory, and everybody knew it. It did not end in the destruction of Lee's army.
The presence of the Federals at Frederick and on the move northward causes Robert E. Lee to concentrate his army east of the mountains. He sends riders to General Ewell at Carlisle with orders to return his corps at once. The stage is now set, and within days, 170,000 men will slam headlong into one another in the greatest confrontation of the American Civil War. The outcome will reverse the fortunes of one army and begin the decline of another. And an address which still resonates in the American psyche will be delivered on hallowed ground to a war-weary nation, reminding all that those who gave the final measure of devotion did so that a nation might live.
Gettysburg has become the Mecca for all Civil War buffs. It just seems to symbolize what that war was about, at least in military terms. You have this aggressive, proud, seemingly invincible Confederate army going up against these stolid Union troops who finally hold their ground and stop the enemy cold. Veterans of the Army of the Potomac would return to Gettysburg for years after the battle, partially because they were enormously proud of what happened there. They felt they had done their best fighting of the war there. The Army of the Potomac was determined to make Gettysburg its monument. And that's one reason why all those pieces of stone and bronze litter that battlefield. That's where they chose to have their war remembered.
The thing which puts the halo around Gettysburg is Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. Because by coming to Gettysburg for what would otherwise have simply been the dedication of a cemetery at Gettysburg, through those brief comments that he makes, he creates an entire universe of meaning for the Battle of Gettysburg. And that universe of meaning has been with us for 150 years, and probably will be for a good long time after that as well. And that address, which he never actually calls the Gettysburg Address, but those words, I think, give to Gettysburg the kind of sacred glow that means that Gettysburg is always one of those places in American history which remains instantly identifiable. As much as Americans may forget, as much as our history teaching may fall very short of giving to people and to the American people as a whole a sense of their past, nevertheless, one of the things that certainly every American recognizes, maybe not in all the details they should, but still we recognize instantly what someone is talking about when they talk about Gettysburg.
The battle started here because a Confederate unit moved into the town sort of poking around. And Lee had orders to all of his commanders, do not bring on a general engagement. But that unit that moved into Gettysburg and started the greatest battle in the history of the continent did so in violation of his orders.
In an example of history placing the right man at the right spot, Kentucky-born Federal cavalry officer John Buford is just such a man. Buford had entered Gettysburg 2 days earlier with 2,700 men and immediately realizes the town's strategic importance. He knows the Confederates are headed in his direction, and if they're able to seize the high ground south and east of town, a Union defeat will be inevitable. The only question remaining is if his dismounted cavalry can hold out long enough for Union infantry to move up.
General Pleasanton, my extreme left reports a large force coming from Fairfield in a direction to strike the Emmitsburg Road this side of Morse Creek. Colonel Gamble has just sent word that General Lee himself has signed a pass for a citizen this morning at Chambersburg. The troops that are coming here were the same I found early this morning at Millersburg or Fairfield. General Reynolds has been advised of all I know. I am very respectfully your obedient servant, J.N.O. Buford.
The first line of Confederates to collide with the Federals are the 2 brigades of Heath's division of A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps.
Colonel Carter! Get them to move up. Get them on line up. Keep your fire hot, damn it. Let's go!
Second break! Ready! Aim! Fire! Load and hold! Brigade! Load and hold!
Alabama! Let's go! We're on for Alabama! Bring them down more! Bring them down more! Go!
Buford, in his battle to buy time, stations his troops on 3 ridges north and west of town: Her, McPherson, and Seminary Ridge. And from his vantage point in the cupola at the Lutheran Seminary, he reports his status to General Meade.
General Meade, the enemy forces, A.P. Hills, are advancing on me at this point and driving my pickets and skirmishers very rapidly. There's also a large force at Heilersburg that is driving my pickets at that point from that direction. General Reynolds is advancing and is within 3 miles of this point with his leading division. I'm positive that the whole of A.P. Hill's force is advancing. J.N.O. Buford.
General John Reynolds soon arrives with troops of the 1st Corps. He confers briefly with Buford to determine if he can hold the line while Reynolds directs more men into the fight. Buford isn't going anywhere, but his men have been engaged in battle, going on 3 hours, and the Confederates keep coming in ever-increasing numbers. Reynolds, directing his men in the midst of the smoke and confusion, is felled by a fatal bullet to the head, leaving no infantry commander in charge of the field. In an urgent message, Buford reports the situation to his cavalry commander.
General Pleasanton, I'm satisfied that Longstreet and Hill have made a junction. A tremendous battle has been raging since 9:30 a.m. with varying success. At the present moment, the battle is raging on the road to Cashtown and within a short cannon range of this town. The enemy's line is in a semicircle on the height from north to west. General Reynolds was killed early this morning. In my opinion, there seems to be no directing person. We need help now. J.N.O. Buford.
Although John Buford really did perform amazingly well on the morning of July 1st, the whole strategy of using dismounted cavalry to hold off and delay a Confederate occupation of Gettysburg, that was a great deed, but it wasn't the only deed. And there are a long list of people who do remarkable things that first day, improvising ways of trying to prevent the Army of Northern Virginia from seizing not only Gettysburg, but the really important piece of real estate, which was Cemetery Hill, just on the south edge of the town. Certainly the most important that way was Oliver Otis Howard, the commander of the 11th Corps, because it is Oliver Otis Howard who secures Cemetery Hill with one of his divisions and who spends all of July 1st making sure that Cemetery Hill is going to be not just a fallback position, but in fact is going to be held by the Union Army. Because if the Army of the Potomac can hold Cemetery Hill, it can hold everything else. Take away Cemetery Hill, abandon Cemetery Hill, and there's almost no good position in south central Pennsylvania for the Army of the Potomac to confront the Confederate Army. So Otis Howard's decision, hold Cemetery Hill, is itself a key decision, maybe the single most important decision made during the course of the battle. Then, in connection with Howard, Abner Doubleday, who takes over command of the First Corps after John Reynolds is killed. Abner Doubleday does a very good job, and a surprisingly good job, as a temporary Corps commander in holding off the onslaught of Lee's army as they are marching in from Cashtown on the road to Gettysburg. Deploys his men well, holds that ground for over 6 hours, and finally makes a last stand at the Lutheran Seminary on Seminary Ridge, in which he himself takes personal part. He actually is assisting cannoneers in the artillery batteries to sight their guns. He takes his own headquarters guard and deploys them in line, and they make this remarkable last stand on Seminary Ridge, which is the final factor, really, in holding off the Confederate onslaught in the direction of Gettysburg.
As the battle rages, an unwitting young general from New York, Francis C. Barlow, commanding the 1st Division of the 11th Corps, moves his men forward to an elevated but exposed position. Much like the error General Dan Sickles will commit in the Peach Orchard on July 2nd, Barlow on Blocker's Knoll extends his line far forward of his 11th Corps. His troops are now vulnerable to attack from multiple sides. And in a timed assault upon Barlow's men at 3 p.m., 2,700 Georgians raise the rebel yell and coordinate their attack from 2 directions, enveloping Barlow. The Confederates steadily push the Union troops back through town in a disorderly rout, leaving behind Barlow, shot twice and helpless on the field. Barlow, however, thanks to Confederate commander John B. Gordon, will survive the battle and go on to survive the war, being only one of a handful of men who enter the conflict as an enlisted man and emerge a general.
A lot of people talk about what caused the battle and whether it was about shoes or about this and that. And essentially the battle happened for very practical military reasons. When you have 2 armies of that size wandering around on road systems, sooner or later some guy on one army and some guy in the other army are going to shoot at each other. What happens when they do in Civil War period is the 2 armies collapse on that point, because if a piece of your army engages a piece of the enemy, the army that gets the most people to that spot quickest will generally win the battle. And if you're attacked at the very rear by the middle of the other army, they're going to concentrate their troops and destroy your army piecemeal. What was fortunate for the Confederates is that one guy took that shot at one other guy right in the middle of the Confederate line of march, which happened to be in front of the Union line of march. So basically there were more Confederates close to that spot when it happened than there were Union troops. And so the first day's fight was a Confederate victory because they got more people here sooner. Overnight on the first night, the Union troops arrived, and by the second day they had more people. But it basically simply happened because one guy took a shot at another guy. People were wandering around, 2 armies close to each other with a few gaps in the mountains. And at one point, a unit of the Confederate Army got near to the Union cavalry unit in the Union Army, and one guy took a shot at a guy. And then 2 more and 2 more. And before long, there was what they described as a general engagement, which led to the battle. So a lot has been said about the Confederates are coming to find shoes. They knew there were no shoes here. There weren't any shoes here, and they knew that. And people come up with reasons, because what you have is the greatest battle in the history of the American continent, and it has to start from some better reason than a couple guys started shooting at each other. It's just, but that's the military reality of it. That's how battles generally happen in many cases. And so we like to make it more, because that sounds kind of boring. Why did the battle happen? Well, a couple guys started shooting at each other. But we try to make more of it than it is. So we create shoe factories and myths and other things.
point after point after point on July 1st, it's not only Buford, but it's division commanders, it's brigade commanders, right down the ladder of command, who do extremely well and perform these wonderful self-initiated deeds, holding that ground, trying to stave off a complete collapse, trying to prevent, and successfully preventing, Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia from just rolling into Gettysburg, rolling up to Cemetery Hill, and occupying what would otherwise have been an extremely difficult position for the Army of the Potomac to have evicted them from.
July 1st ranks as the 10th bloodiest day of the Civil War, and numerically, the Confederates gain the advantage. By day's end, Union forces suffer almost 9,000 casualties, 3,000 more than the troops under Robert E. Lee. Each army will begin the next day battered and bruised, and the second day at Gettysburg will witness some of the most intense fighting yet in the war.
One of the things that people don't always get when they come to the battlefield and visit is the tremendous experience of the people who lived here. This is a very small carriage-making farming town that suddenly had thrown on it, 170,000 troops and their ammunition and explosives and fence destruction and all that kind of stuff. And so the experience of the people who were here is really compelling. The Army left a couple of days after the battle and left behind 20,000 wounded and dead horses and munitions and broken wagons and all of that. And these people, in the midst of their summer growing season, had to try and recover from all that before fall, and then just sort of get on with their lives despite all the destruction.
July 1st is a great day for heroism, but July 2nd outdoes it.
Lieutenant Charles A. Fuller, 61st New York. I think it was between 5 and 6 o'clock when our orders came, and we were ready. It was preferable to advance into action, rather than to wait in expectation of the order to move. In front of us, across the road, was a wheat field, which is bounded by a fence. We were ordered forward, we scaled the fence, and advanced into the wheat field in line of battle. As soon as the alignment was perfected, the officers and file closers passed through the ranks and got in the rear of the men. Up to this time, not a Confederate had been seen in our front.
The 61st took 90 muskets into the fight. They are in an exposed position on the right flank of the line, in the middle of the field. Heading straight towards them are troops from Anderson's Georgia Brigade. The Wheatfield at Gettysburg is considered among the bloodiest pieces of ground in the entire Civil War. The 19-acre field of wheat will change hands 6 times and claim more than 6,000 men, either killed, wounded, or captured. Like the bloody cornfield at Antietam, survivors of the intense fighting in the Wheatfield swore a man could walk across the field on bodies alone without ever touching the ground.
Felt a blow on the left leg, and it gave way. While lying here entirely helpless and hearing those vicious bullets singing over my head, I suffered from fear. Lieutenant Charles A. Fuller, 61st New York.
After losing over half its strength in a few minutes, the 61st is ordered back to the shelter of the woods. Lieutenant Fuller is found alive at midnight by Private Phil Comfort of Company A, among the groaning and dying men in the trampled field. Fortunately for Fuller, Comfort was noted for his habit of relieving dead men of their valuables after battles, when darkness set in.
The Battle of Gettysburg is a series of actions taken by certain individuals at crucial times that meant the difference between victory and defeat. In the fight for Little Round Top, a lot of the credit goes to Joshua Chamberlain, whose 20th Maine held the far left of the Union line. But it was Chamberlain's brigade commander, Strong Vincent, who put his brigade on Little Round Top without receiving orders from his division commander to do so. And during that fight for Little Round Top, just as Chamberlain's left was being pressed, so too Vincent's right was being pressed, and it looked like it was about to crumble. Vincent will get on top of a boulder and full sight of his men and full sight of the enemy, shout to his men, "Don't give an inch," before he's gunned down, before he's mortally wounded. And that's just one of many self-sacrificing acts made by certain Union soldiers and Union commanders during this fight that really spelled the difference. Another unsung hero of Little Round Top is Patrick O'Rourke, Paddy O'Rourke, Irish Catholic who went through West Point, which was largely a WASP Protestant institution. He came from the bottom of the economic heap, which was unusual, but he was hardworking, he was intelligent, he won the respect of his classmates, and he's in charge of the 140th New York. And just as it looks like Strong Vincent's brigade is about to be swamped by the attacking Confederates, he arrives on top of Little Round Top, spots the situation, doesn't even give his men time to deploy. He just yells, "Follow me." They go surging down the hill. He's killed, and his men are so infuriated that they just tear into the Confederates and repulse another attack.
In the research for my first book, I met and spent time with 5 men who remembered their grandfathers who fought in the 20th Maine at Gettysburg. I think the main reason that Joshua Chamberlain's story outshines a lot of others, first of all, is that he survived. One of the things that is important in telling your story sometimes is to be around to tell it, and a lot of the other officers on Little Round Top, the commanding officers, were killed. And that's sort of the beginning, but I think from the time the battle happened, so little it was expected of him, being a minister and a college professor, not a West Point grad, and having no real military experience. The fact that he and his regiment performed as well as they did was quite surprising to the other people in the brigade and in the Army. And so that began this story of Chamberlain as this unlikely hero. Among the reasons that Chamberlain was chosen to accept the Confederate infantry surrender was largely that he was one of the last commanding officers still around. Of course, Grant and Lee, as soon as the agreement was signed, both left. I think one of the reasons that Grant chose Chamberlain to supervise the surrender of the Confederate infantry at Appomattox was that he had really built a record for himself going back through the several previous months and gained Grant's notice a number of times. He was badly wounded leading his men in a charge at Petersburg, and Grant promoted him on the spot to brigadier general. He had performed very, very well at the Battle of Five Forks just before the surrender at Appomattox, and he had developed a reputation as quite a fighter and a leader, and Grant recognized that. And other commanders of greater rank than Chamberlain were either no longer there or busy doing other things, and so he decided to sort of bestow that honor on him. This whole idea of honor answering honor and the pageantry of a surrender was probably not all that exciting to them then, and now we look back on it as an important moment.
Winfield Scott Hancock, Major General, Commander of the Second Corps, turns around and sees the entirety of Cadmus Wilcox's Confederate brigade coming across the road. Hancock turns, looks for reinforcements to plug up the gaps, and only sees one regiment, and that is Colville's 1st Minnesota. And he says, "You need to move right into that gap. Do you see those flags pointing to the Confederate colors? Take those flags. Colville's got one regiment. He's got 262 men. He doesn't even balk. Lines his men up, takes them forward at a trot. Here is one understrength Federal regiment taking on an entire big Confederate brigade. The odds are at least 8-1 in the Confederate favor.
Alfred P. Carpenter, Company K, 1st Minnesota. The Rebs came in 2 splendid lines, firing as they advanced, capturing one of our batteries, which they turned against us, and gained the cover of the ravine. The plain was strewn with dead and dying men. The Rebs had advanced their batteries and were hurtling death and destruction into the ranks of our retreating men. They were nearing the hill, which if gained, the day was lost to us. Then came the order for the 2nd Division of the 2nd Corps to advance. The hill must be held at all hazards. We advanced down the slope till we neared the ravine and charged one along the line. And with a rush and a yell we went. Bullets whistled past us. Shells screeched over us. Canister and grape fell about us. Comrade after comrade dropped from the ranks, but on the line went. No one took a second look at his fallen companion. We had no time to weep. We were nearing the rebel line, and in a moment more, we would have been at it hand to hand. 2 regiments on our right faltered and subjected us to a flank fire, and we were ordered back, leaving our dead within a few rods of the rebel line. Then forward we went again, and the rebels were routed, and the bloody field was in our possession, but at what cost? The ground was strewn with dead and dying, whose groans and prayers and cries for help and water rent the air. Alfred P. Calvary, Company K, 1st Minnesota.
Not bad, not bad.
For all that has been written about the Battle of Gettysburg, and there has been a tremendous amount written, there's still surprisingly large amounts of material. There's large numbers of stories which have never yet been told, and which it has been both fun and an education in its own right to uncover. I think, for instance, of an individual like Francis Heath. Francis Heath was the lieutenant colonel of the 19th Maine, not a professional soldier. He, in fact, had come fresh out of Colby College and out of his father's law office, where he was reading law, to become an officer in the 19th Maine. He is in effective charge of the regiment at Gettysburg, and on July 2nd, as the Federal line is breaking to pieces and the Confederate tide looks like it's about to roll over everyone, Heath is in command of his Maine regiment as one of those posted to try to hold off the retreat of the battered 3rd Corps. In the midst of the smoke and the confusion, the confused retreat of clumps and units of 3rd Corps troops, one of the division commanders of the 3rd Corps appears out of the battle murk, and that is Andrew Atkinson Humphreys. Humphreys' division has been chewed to pieces, and Humphreys is beside himself. He has had a very long and a very difficult day, and there's a way in which Humphreys has simply at this point lost it. Humphreys comes up to the 19th Maine, tells the men to fix their bayonets and to use them on any of the fleeing soldiers of his own division. And Francis Heath hears this and can't believe it. He didn't volunteer to fight in this war to kill his own people. And as Humphreys is raving out of control up and down the front of the 19th Maine, Heath decides he's not going to let this stand. He follows Humphreys. Humphreys is going down the line of the 19th Maine. Fix these bayonets, use them on those men. And Heath is following behind this Major General and saying, don't pay any attention to him. Don't listen to him. Don't do it. Don't do it. He says, look, we'll rally your men on our own, but we're not going to kill them the way you want to. And Humphreys finally, facing Heath's refusal to cooperate, just wanders off, and he has his own conscience he's going to have to face. But I thought, what a remarkable moment, that even in the midst of that stress and that battle, here is someone who has not lost his sense of decency and balance and is willing to do something about it, even if it means telling off a Major General. The one brigade which is left to hold Culp's Hill is under George Sears Green, who is the oldest general officer in the Federal Army. Old Pappy Green, as they called him, has only one brigade, and what he doesn't realize is that there is an entire Confederate division in position ready to attack Culp's Hill, which they did. And when those Confederates, an entire division worth, come up Culp's Hill trying to seize the hill, Green's little brigade shoots them to pieces.
By the end of the day, Longstreet has bloodied the Union Army. He's pretty much destroyed the Third Corps, but he hasn't broken through. The Federal line still holds, and many historians will argue that by the end of the second day, Lee had really lost the Battle of Gettysburg.
I think it's probably safe to say that the decision Robert E. Lee makes to attack with Pickett's division straight on, headlong, on July 3rd is probably made sometime between midnight and 5 o'clock on the morning of July 3rd. It was not a strategy that he had worked out in advance. It rather is a tactic that he resorts to in response to the immediate situation.
Students of the third day at Gettysburg focus on the grand finale, Pickett's charge. But on the right flank, there was a lively cavalry battle fought between anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 Confederates under Jeb Stuart, and now historians say about 3,000 Union troopers under David Gregg and a young brigadier named George Armstrong Custer. Custer, he's young, he's not used to managing a brigade, but he exercises a personal brand of leadership that quickly wins the hearts of his Michigan troopers.
General David Gregg, Federal Cavalry. The orders from General Pleasonton were not in alignment with our situation. General Pleasonton had received word from General Howard that a large Confederate body of troops were advancing upon our position, and for some unknown reason had ordered General Custer's men to join Kilpatrick on our left flank near the Round Tops. There was not a moment to lose, and I countermanded General Pleasonton's order. I reported to General Custer, "Say you never got the message. I need you here."
Brigadier General George Armstrong Custer. Upon receiving word from General Gregg, I understood as he did the situation fully. If the enemy were allowed to break through our lines to Meade's rear on Cemetery Ridge, it would not only be disastrous, the entire Battle of Gettysburg would be lost. I reported to General Gregg that I would be only too glad to stay upon his order and would be well pleased to remain with my brigade. General Gregg gave the order, and the great cavalry battle of Gettysburg was commenced.
climactic final charge, when there are 1,500 or more Confederate troopers coming down to try to pierce the Union center there, Custer will place himself in front of only 500 men from his 1st Michigan Cavalry. They're the only reserve the Union has. He will lead them forward in a charge. He will spur his horse at the last moment so every man behind him can see him, and then he raises his saber and yells, "Come on, you Wolverines!"
Unable to withstand the impetuosity of our attack, the enemy gave way in a disorderly rout. I cannot find the language to express my high appreciation for the gallantry and daring displayed by officers and men of the 1st Michigan Cavalry, and I challenge the annals of warfare to produce a more brilliant or successful charge. George Armstrong Custer.
Gettysburg is often described as being the high water mark of the Confederacy. And you can see that there's some reason for that, because this Confederate invasion of Pennsylvania never gets any further than Gettysburg. Although it is hard to get this entirely in focus, because in fact Confederate units had penetrated substantially farther to the north. Richard Ewell's corps, for instance, had gone all the way up to Carlisle and even lobbed a few shells across the Susquehanna River at Harrisburg. Jubal Early's division had gotten all the way to York and to Wrightsville, and might in fact have gotten across the Susquehanna on the Great Wrightsville Railroad Bridge had not Federal troops, in this case mostly militia, managed to destroy the bridge before he could use it. So if we really want to mark a literal high point of the Confederate invasion, it really belongs somewhere in the neighborhood of Carlisle, Pennsylvania, rather than Gettysburg. And there are other moments when Confederates get loose on Northern territory. John Morgan is going to stage a major raid into Ohio in 1863. And in 1864, there's even a Confederate raid on St. Albans, Vermont. All right, yes, they launch it from Canada, so maybe that's not fair. But if you really want a high water mark, I suppose St. Albans, Vermont will do. But if we put this in terms of metaphor, then it begins to have more meaning. Because Gettysburg is a serious setback to the Confederacy, and for a number of reasons. One is the stupendous casualties the Army of Northern Virginia absorbs in this battle. The Army never comes back up to the strength that it had as it marched into Pennsylvania. Never actually recovers in terms of numbers. It will sustain serious damage to its morale, but the morale, in fact, will recover before the end of 1863. It's the numbers that are going to prove increasingly difficult to reconstitute an army with. There's also the damage done to Lee's reputation. And I don't mean some kind of invincibility that now federal commanders believe they really can defeat Robert E. Lee. Actually, the real damage done to Lee's reputation is done in the Confederacy. One soldier in the Army of the Potomac writes home, "Now what do you think of your Army of the Potomac?" That is a high water mark.
What we know about Gettysburg comes from a variety of sources. There are the official reports, there are the memoirs written by generals and later by lower-ranking soldiers, sometimes as far down as private. There are the franker testimonies that come from unpublished letters and diaries. And then there's the heroic effort of a fellow named John Batchelder, who worked with veterans to try to get the story straight, who worked very hard to collect veteran testimony, trying to place where the various regiments deployed, where they moved, what they experienced. The man just collected a treasure trove of information, which still really hasn't been fully exploited by historians. Some have caught on to that and are utilizing his archive. But I think that what we think we know about Gettysburg will continue to change and continue to expand thanks to his efforts.
The day had opened with a reignited engagement on Culp's Hill. This, along with Jeb Stuart's cavalry attack, is part of Lee's grand strategy to divert the Federals' attention and forces away from their center. For Union infantry not engaged at Culp's Hill, the day settles into an uneasy calm. By noon, men compare the atmosphere to the stillness of the Sabbath day. In a council of war the evening before, General Meade had decided the Federals would hold their ground and await any movement of the enemy. Their wait will not be long. General Lee plans an early start to the main charge to coincide with the attack upon Culp's Hill. James Longstreet in overall command, however, spends most of the morning arranging his assault force. This delay, some historians claim, is Longstreet's deliberate undermining of what he considers a doomed attack.
Private John Dooley, Pickett's Division, July 3rd. Before the day was fully dawned, we are on our way to occupy the position assigned to us for the conflict of the third day. Uncle Robert, silent and motionless, awaits our passing by, and anxiously does he gaze upon the only division of his army whose numbers have not been thinned by the terrible fires of Gettysburg. I must confess that the general's face does not look as bright as though he were certain of success. But yet it is impossible for us to be any otherwise than victorious, and we press forward with beating hearts, hundreds of which will throb their last today. How long we take to gain our position, what delays, what suspense. We are soon passing over the battlefield of yesterday, and the details of burying parties are digging graves to receive the freshly fallen comrades. Orders come for us to lie down in line of battle, that all the cannon on our side will open at a given signal, will continue for an hour, and upon their ceasing, we are to charge straight ahead over the open field and sweep from our path anything in the shape of a Yankee that attempts to oppose our progress. At last it sounds away to the right, and the echoes have scarcely rebounded from the rocks of the mountain, when the earth, mountains, and sky seem to open and darken the air with smoke, death-dealing missiles. Never will I forget those scenes and sounds. The earth seems unsteady beneath this furious cannonading, and the air might be said to be agitated by the wings of death. Over 400 guns nearly every minute being discharged. The ammunition wagons fly back and forth, bringing up fresh supplies of ammunition, and still the air is shaking from earth to sky, with every missile of death fired from the cannon's mouth. Around, above, beneath, and on all sides they screech, sing, scream, whistle, roar, whir, buzz, bang, and whiz. And we are obliged to lie quietly, though frightened out of our wits, and unable to do anything in our own defense or any injury to our enemies. Our artillery has now ceased to roar, and the enemy have checked their fury too. The time appointed for our charge is come. There is no romance in making one of these charges. When you rise to your feet as we did today, I tell you the enthusiasm of ardent breasts in many cases ain't there. And instead of burning to avenge the insults of our country, families and altars and firesides, and the thought is most frequently, oh, if I could just come out of this charge safely, how thankful would I be? And the guns are ours. But who can stand such a storm of hissing lead and iron? What a relief if Earth, which almost seems to hurl these implements of death in our faces, would open now and afford a secure retreat from threatening death. Every officer is in front. Colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors, captains, all press on and cheer the shattered lines. Oh, how I long to know the result. The end of this fearful charge. Listen. We hear a new shout, and cheer after cheer rends the air. Are those fresh troops advancing to our support? No. No. That huzzah never broke from southern lips. Oh God, Virginia's bravest, noblest sons have perished here today, and perished all in vain.
Robert Todd Lincoln was home from Harvard. And on the morning when Lincoln got the message about Lee's escape, Robert went into his father's office, and there he found his father head down on his desk, weeping in frustration and despair. And Abraham Lincoln said to his eldest son, "We had them in the palm of our hands. We had only to close our fingers, and they were ours. The war would be over." Once the Confederate tide recedes, once Pickett's division falls back and then Pettigrew's division falls back defeated, people could realize that this last spectacular bid by the Army of Northern Virginia for victory had lapped up onto the farm of a free black man. A man who, by every definition the Confederacy stood for, shouldn't have even existed. The final stand of the Confederacy and the Army of Northern Virginia at Gettysburg takes place on his property. And as the sun goes down, not only on the 3rd of July, but as it goes down on the Army of Northern Virginia, on the Confederacy itself, Abraham Bryan's property will remain his, and he will remain a free man, and he will come back and he will farm his acres until he sells the property in 1869. And he will sit under his vine and under his fig tree. Nobody will disturb him. And if there's anybody who was the greatest and ultimate victor at Gettysburg, we might be able to say it was that black farmer, Abraham Bryan.